Hey guys. Well, as you can hear, I've got a little bit of a cold, so my voice may go out on this. I'm not entirely sure, but if it does, it does, and we just start over, I suppose. Anyway, we're going to turn our gaze now in this all too brief class of ours from classical East Asian philosophy in China, Japan, Korea, places like that, to classical South Asian philosophy, and specifically the philosophy of Hinduism, or what I prefer to call more than Hinduism, Brahmanical thought, for some reasons I'll talk about in a little bit. Now, doing this, I got to tell you, is kind of a tricky thing. It's tricky in a little different way than the switch to Taoism was tricky. It's tricky in the sense that there is really very little consistency as far as specifics go within classical South Asian thought, within Brahmanical thought. You want a metaphor for what that's like? I'll give you a metaphor. Metaphor, go look at a traffic jam in Mumbai, India. That's a metaphor for this stuff. It is all over the frickin' place. I mean, really, it is. It's everywhere, you know. But the thing is that in a beautiful sort of way, it's that almost exquisite energy and diversity and way in which everything in its entropy, to use a word out of the physical sciences, almost allows for a kind of holism, a kind of persistence, a kind of permanence, a kind of absoluteness that uh, that is not just in spite of the diversity, but almost as the grounding that allows for the very possibility of diversity at all. And that's pretty tricky stuff to get to. So here's what I propose to do. I want to say a little bit in this little lecture just about the social and cultural and maybe a little of the historical background that go into this. And then in the next lecture, I want to begin, and probably lecture, as it's probably going to take more than one, but I want to say a little bit about some of the terms that you're going to run across in the Upanishads, what they mean, and even more than that, thematically, how to approach them. Because I think that's often in the midst of all of this diversity, that might be the best way to go. So, shall we begin? All right, well, so I've asked you guys to look at the Upanishads. What are the Upanishads? Well, the Upanishads are a section of a group of four sacred texts, four sacred works called the Vedas. Now, the Vedas are a collection of texts. It's a Sanskrit word. The language that all of this is written in is the language called Sanskrit. It's actually distantly related to English and German. It's the Indo of the Indo-European languages. It's the ancient language of India, and it's the language that most of the Indian and actually many of the Southeast Asian languages are either directly or indirectly derived from, even today. Hindi and Maharashtra and languages like that, Bengali. Anyway, so this language is Sanskrit, and the Vedas are written in Sanskrit. There is a lot of tradition about them. Some of the more orthodox, such as we can say that there is orthodox Hindus, will say that the Vedas were not even written, that they're simply part of the fabric of the universe, and that their manifestation as written language is simply something that we encounter in being what we are. It's like the wallpaper on the sky of the world, so to speak. But anyway, they are central, and it would be a mistake to call them the Word of God. That's not really the way that they're approached. Rather, what they are is, I suppose, what the word itself in Sanskrit means. The word Veda means knowledge. Um, you've probably heard of maybe Ayurveda, sort of for health sciences in it's sort of popularized these days, even for Indian alternative medicines, things like that. Well, Veda just means knowledge, and the different Vedas, in particular the one Veda that we're looking probably most at, the two I suppose we look at most are the Sama Veda and the Rig Veda. These Vedas, along with the Artha Veda and the Yajur Veda, make up the four Vedas, make up the core of which this cosmology of Brahmanical thought blooms and blossoms from. Where does it come from? Well, it comes originally from a group of people called the Aryans. The Aryan peoples were sort of a cultural linguistic group. They originally probably lived around southern Ukraine, Bulgaria, places like that, but they migrated, actually invaded, into India sometime probably in the 3rd millennium BCE, so between 3000 and 2000 BCE, closer to the end of it, so closer to 2000 BCE, and both displaced and absorbed many of the peoples who were living in India, called the Dravidian peoples. The mixing of these two groups, of the Aryan peoples coming in from the north and bringing their religion and their Vedas with them, or what would become the Vedas anyway, mixing with the Dravidian peoples, the darker peoples who originally inhabited, and who there are still vestiges of inside of India, especially in South India, in the languages of Tamil and Telugu, and things like this, form what comes to be Brahmanical thought and the Vedas. The Vedas themselves are like a lot of ancient texts. We can give them dates as far as when we can record when they're written down. The forms we have, probably the oldest of them is one called the Rig Veda, and that's the oldest written version. It's probably something that appeared around 1500 BCE, but they come from oral traditions and are probably much older than this. These themselves, the Vedas, are divided into 4 parts. So there's 4 Vedas, and each of the 4 Vedas are divided into 4 parts. You've got the priestly rituals. You've got the chants or hymns, sometimes called mantras. You've got a section called the forest texts, which are the applications of the rituals and the interpretation of the rituals and the hymns. So what the priests were supposed to do with these things. All these are interesting and important, but they, as far as our discussions in philosophy go, they have some limitations. But then you have this 4th area, the Upanishads. Now, the word Upanishad in Sanskrit, again, the language that this is all written and done in, means sit down and listen. And specifically, these are sit down and listens between a teacher and the student, or just the sayings or teachings of a teacher. They are a bit like the Tao, what we saw in the Tao Te Ching, very aphoristic, very short, very dense. And that it's meant to be that way because they're meant to be condensations of ideas, things that are supposed to be held together in this particular way, so that a teacher would be able to take these things and express them and work them through. Again, you have something similar to what you had with Confucius, that in some of them in particular, it's looking at what's going on in the relationship between the student and the master, the teacher, the guru, usually as it's put, or sometimes the acharya. I'll say a little bit more about what the word guru in particular means. It's a very interesting notion. But this is the way in which it's meant to be read, as a lesson in the spiritual teaching, and is in the awakening of the student by the teacher, and what it reveals about the nature of understanding, of self, of identity, of action, of meaning, of many of these things, of these great cosmic questions. What can I say more about this? Well, I suppose there's probably other things to bring up. There's all sorts of Upanishads that exist sort of outside of this tradition as well. But what I'm having you read are a collection of what are the most famous Upanishads. These are the Upanishads that commentaries must be written on in order to be considered within the general philosophical discourse. These are the classics that, if anything, marks a canon. I'm a little reluctant to say that because you don't have a Bible or a Quran in this tradition the way you do in the West. Rather, I think what you have are starting points, places where roots grow out and proceed from. So it's looking at what these roots are, what these social, cultural, linguistic roots are. Try to have a sense of them, to pick them up, to imagine them as you read through this and make sense of that, and keep that in mind. And with that, I will stop and begin to talk about the more significant philosophical issues, I think, namely the philosophical themes that come through this. So, see you in a second.